Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pei Aleph. It's the daf for first day of Pesach. Chag Sameach to everyone. We're going to get started with a review of the end of yesterday's daf. So we started with this statement of a Braita of Rabbi Chia, where Rabbi Chia basically explains that a toda that got mixed up with its tmura, so we have a toda and a substitute for a toda, which again, you're not allowed to do, but if you do, it has to be sacrificed. But you don't sacrifice it with the breads. And then one of them dies, one of the animals that was designated. Chavirta ema takana. There's nothing you could do about with the one that's left, because if it's a toda, then it needs its bread. If it's not a toda, you can't do it with the bread, so you don't have a way to resolve it. And therefore, because you can't bring it without the bread, you can't bring it with the breads, you're stuck. What do you do? So we had three answers yesterday by the Limedim Lifnei Rebbe, which we explained was Levi, which is either just bring bread and say the following. Either the bread, and let's take the animal that you designated. If it's a toda, so the bread goes with the toda. If it's not a toda, but it's the tmura, the one that's left, then the bread is just chulin. But the Gemara said, how could you do that? You're bringing chulin into the azara, which you're not allowed to do. Then they said, okay, well, let's try to bring another animal and the bread. And then you could say, if the first one is a toda, then the bread goes with that one. And the second one will just be a shlamim. And if it was a tmura, then the second one, right, the one that's left is a tmura, then the bread goes with the second one. And the second one is brought as a toda. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? Then you're taking a shlamim and you're limiting the amount of time it can be eaten, and you're going to have to burn it if not. We don't ever want to do that. We don't like to limit the time at which you can eat it, because a regular shlamim can be eaten for 2 days, and a toda can only be eaten for 1 day, that day and the night, and therefore it's a problem. The next option was very similar, except it said, why don't you make the second one a motar toda? Just say that the second animal you designated, if it's tmura, the one that's left, then you're fine. The second one just as brought as a toda with the bread. But if the one that remained is a toda, then the second one becomes what we call a motar toda, leftovers from a toda. But the Gemara says to that, okay, that's where we're going to start from the top of our daf. When he hears this, who said this? Right, Rebbe said this to Levi. Okay, this guy must have no brain in his head. Because what is motar? Motar is something left over when you designated two and then you didn't need that first one, or it's extra money was paid for and you had extra money. It's something that is created. It's not something that you could create lechatchila and say, oh, I'm going to make this into a motar just in case. So basically, they reject that. Okay, next possibility. We're up to number 4. Yativ Rabbi Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Marta kamei to Rav Nachman. So Rabbi Yitzchak, the son of Shmuel bar Marta, was sitting in front of Rav Nachman, and he says to Rav Nachman, "Yativ b'kamer." Okay, you can see here that it's the same suggestion: animal and bread. Okay, bring an extra animal and the 40 loaves of bread. Velema, and say the following: Ihach dekaima tmurahi. Again, we're up to, well, if it's tmura, it's again the same thing as what Levi had suggested in the last two options, which is the second animal is just your toda with the breads. So hatoda v'halachma. Ihach dekaima todahi. If the one that's left is the toda, well, halachma v'hatahavi tmura. Why don't we just call this second one, this new one we brought, a tmura? It was a replacement one. Now, remember the problem. The problem is you're not allowed to do tmura. But let's just call it the replacement one, and then you actually can sacrifice the tmura. So sacrifice that one. And then again, you're going to sacrifice and say either it's the good one, right, it's the toda, or it's a tmura of a toda. To which you can probably see where the Gemara is going with this. So Amar Le, Rav Nachman says to him, Ani Mari, Arba'im b'katve b'kasher, right? What are you talking about? You're going to get 40 lashes and you're going to call this kosher? This is a negative prohibition from the Torah. You're not allowed to make an animal into a tmura. You can't decide, oh, I'm just going to replace this animal with another one. So, of course, you can't say that. Rav Ila chalash. Rav Ila was sick. So they went to visit him, Abaye and the rabbis, and they suggested, why don't we go back to option 1 that Levi had said? And they said, now, from here, we're going to see 3. Okay, there's an extra section in this chart which has 3 explanations that are all based on if we hold like so-and-so about the following thing, then we have a solution. So they say the following. If we hold like Rabbi Yochanan, if the breads are outside the azara, they can still become sanctified with the slaughtering and the sprinkling of the blood of the toda. Well then, we have a solution to the original problem in the first one. Just bring bread with the animal. And we had a problem. Well, aren't you bringing chulin lazara? So don't bring it into the azara. And say the following. Ihach todahi. Say, if the one that's still existing, the one that didn't die, is the toda, then halachma. Then here's its bread. Ve'ilo, lipukul chulin. And if not, just call it chulin, and it's totally fine. What's the problem? Well, mishum di'ika arba lahanif. The problem is you have 4 that go to the kohen that are supposed to be waved. Hey, chiliavid, what are you going to do with them? Linfinu abarai. If you do it outside, lifnei Hashem k'tiv, it says you have to do it before God. Gavai, if you want to do it inside, kamal chulin lazara. You bring chulin into the azara, which you obviously can't do. So that's not going to work. Okay, hilkach lo efshar. So the Gemara says, okay, this is not a possibility. Okay, moving on to number 6. Again, these are all suggestions. Why didn't Rabbi Chia suggest this? And each time we have an answer. Why this doesn't work? Matkiv la Rav Shisha bereid Rav Idi. V'im ita l'dechizkia. If we hold like Chizkia, damar kadshu arba'im mitoch hashmonim. If you take 80, but you really only need 40, so only 40 will be sanctified. This sounds like it's going to be a good solution. Because then what are we going to do? Leite behema, bring another animal. V'leite shmonim bahada, and bring 80 loaves with it. And lema, and then go to the temple with your other original animal that was left, and say the following. Ihach dekaima todahi. If the one that's still existent is a toda, then perfect. Hanami tavi toda. Then we have 2 todas. We have the old one and this new animal we just brought. The hashmonim de travayu, and then the 80 go with both of them. 40 for this, 40 for that. Ihach dekaima tmurahi. If the one that's still in existence is a tmura, then what are you going to do? Ha toda v'halachma melikdishulu arba'im mitoch hashmonim. So the one that we're going to bring now, the second animal, is the toda. We'll bring that one with the breads, and only 40 out of 80 will be sanctified. To which the Gemara says, no, here's a problem. Mishum dekamimai ba'achila da'arba'im. There's a difference in the girsi, whether it's arba'im or arba'a. Okay, it's either 4 or 40. But we're basically concerned that you're going to have trouble eating all the loaves. Okay, I shouldn't say basically what the issue is, because there's a debate what the issue is. Some people think the problem is the 40 loaves, that you basically now have 80 loaves, and you have to get rid of 80 loaves, and that's a crazy amount of loaves to get rid of in such a short time. We're talking not small loaves of bread. These were gigantic loaves of bread. I think there were, if I remember, 8 kilo in every one. Okay, something like that. It's really a lot of bread. I might have the numbers off, but it's a huge amount of bread, of flour. Actually, not in all of them, but some of them. There were large amounts. I think there were 10 that were chametz. Those are the ones I think that had 8 kilos, something crazy like that. Anyway, some of them are smaller, but there's 40 of them, and then you have 80, and you have to get rid of it in a really short amount of time. You're going to end up burning them. Or maybe we're even talking about the 4 to the Kohen, and one of the issues could be that when you give 4 to the Kohen, now you're giving them 8. Well, the Kohen might not also have what to do with 8, and you might have trouble distributing to Kohanim. I don't know if there was a shortage of Kohanim. It's a little unclear what the issue is. Some people think that no one's going to want to eat those 4 because the Kohen's going to say, well, they're not necessarily mine. And the owner's going to say, well, they're not necessarily mine. And then you'll have a problem also that nobody will eat them. Anyway, there seems to be some problem with too many loaves here. Okay, so that doesn't work. Next, Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana. V'im itali de Rabbi Yochanan. He quotes, before Abai and the rabbi suggested if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan on this issue, now we're going to hold like Rabbi Yochanan on a different issue. If you hold like Rabbi Yochanan to Amar, he frish chata me'uberet v'yalda. Okay, now we have a few things to learn because we're going to talk about a different situation where you have a sin offering and you designated a pregnant animal for it. And then you set it aside. You didn't bring the sacrifice yet. And in the meantime, yalda, the offspring is born. Ratzah ba mitkaper, ratzah bivlada mitkaper. You can choose, do you want to use for your sacrifice the mother or the offspring? Now, what does this mean? Well, the assumption right now is that this is because there's a debate how we view a fetus. Is the fetus part of the mother and just like a limb of the mother? It's called ubar yerechimo. It's just like the thigh of the mother. Or is it not yerechimo and it's its own independent unit? So if we view it as its own independent unit, that's why in the end, when the animal's born, you could say, oh, both were sanctified, and you can choose which one you want to use. Now, the Gemara says, or Rav Ashi says, based on that, why don't we say the following? Let's apply this same issue with chatat to our situation and say the following. Leite behemam uberet. Bring a pregnant animal. designated for the extra sacrifice, right? In other words, you have your original one, and now you take another animal that's pregnant. V'yamtin la'ajitele, wait till she gives birth. And then you can say the following. And before that, lete shmonim bahada. So you bring another animal, but this time instead of just a regular animal, you bring an animal that's pregnant. And then you wait till she gives birth. You now have 2 animals and 80 loaves of bread. Belema, and you say the following. Ihach dekaima tmurahi, ha'uvlada todehi. The one that's still around is the tmura. Then very well, we have this animal and its offspring, and we basically call them both todas, bring them each with 40 breads, and we're good. V'ihach dekaima todehu. And if the one that's still around is a toda, hanami todehi, v'hashmonim detravayuhu. Then we have the original toda, and we have the mother, and that's going to be 40 altogether. V'avlad, and then we say, right, the vlad is basically going to be motar toda, okay? V'hai lahavi motar de toda. Then the vlad is just a leftover toda, and then you sacrifice that without the bread. So Amarle, so now the response of Rav Kahana to Rav Ashi is, what are you talking about? Man lemalanta Amar Rabbi Yochanan im shiaro meshuyal. Does Rabbi Yochanan really think, when he said that if you designate the chatat of a pregnant animal and then the woman gives birth, if you want, you can atone with it. If you want, you can, right, atone with the vlad. Does he really mean? You think he really means you can just designate this animal for whatever you wanted to? That's while it was sanctified in utero, now you could do with it whatever you want. You can make it a toda if you want. Dilma im shialo. Maybe you can't just designate it for whatever you want, like the suggestion just said. Maybe not. Behind Tamid Rabbi Yochanan, why? If so, and what they're basically saying is ubar is not yerachimo; it's its own independent unit, and then you could do with it whatever you want. And that's why we thought Rabbi Yochanan said that if you designated the animal and it was for the sin offering, you can just choose whichever one you want. Now, I say that's not the way to understand, or it's not the only way. Maybe you can understand Rabbi Yochanan differently. This offspring is what we call shevach hekdesh. It's a proceed that came out of something that's sanctified, and that's why it can be used for a sin offering. You can use that instead of its mother because you can actually get atonement with value, with something that came from something that was sanctified. But it doesn't mean that you could just decide, oh, well, I'll make this a bread off, I'll make this a toda offering if I want, depending on, whatever you want to do with it. No, really, ubar is yerachimo. It's a part of the mother. It's not an own independent animal that you could just say, oh, this was sanctified already and we could do with it what we want. So that doesn't work. Okay, so moving on. And what Rashi explains here, the Ktav Rashi b'Ktav Yad, basically says, La'olam im kareh echad mehem have idach motar. No matter what this really saying is, because you can get atonement from the Shevach Hekdesh, what it basically means is when Rabbi Yochanan says, if you want this one, you can use this one, you can use the other one if you want, but the other one is always going to be motar. You can't just say, I'm going to designate this for a toda offering, or you can't do that. It's not an option. It's always going to be motar. In other words, either the mother or the offspring will be the leftover. Once you choose one, the other automatically goes into leftover status. Okay, Ravina ikle l'dam horia. We're now on finally the last explanation. Actually be the closest to maybe managing to be an explanation. By the end, they're going to reject it for a different reason. So Ravina comes to dam horia. Amalei Rav Dimi bered Rav Huna midam horia leRavina. So Rav Dimi, the son of Rav Huna, comes to from dam horia, says to Ravina, "Belete behima, velema hare alai." Take another animal and say hare alai. We saw that yesterday. I'm taking this animal upon me with responsibility, meaning if something happens to the animal, I'll have to bring a different one in its stead. Belete behima achrite. Now take another one to be in its stead for achrayut, as we say, but only potential achrayut. We'll see. Velete shmonim bahada. So it's a little similar to the previous, where we're going to end up with 2 animals, 2 extra animals. We're going to end up altogether with 3. And we're going to have 80 loaves. Velete shmonim bahada. Okay, bring 80 with you. And lema and say the following. Ihaf tekaima tmurahi. If the one that's left is a tmura, then hane tarte todot. Then the 2 that I just designated, the hare alai, I'm taking upon me, and the extra one are both todas, and bring 40 loaves with each. Ihaf tekamaita todehi. And if the one that's still existence is the toda, then what are you going to say? Hada amre alai, nami lahavi toda. right? The one you said Harei Alai, so you're going to bring that one, obviously. So we have the original one with 40 loaves, that animal with 40 loaves, and Hashmonim de Travayu, the 80 go with both of those. The Idach Tavilach Rayud, and the other one is an animal that was given for Achrayut. Okay, and then you're good, right? So now, and then you're going to say the following, right? You just have this extra animal that was brought for Achrayut, and that is totally fine. So now, what's the problem? They're going to say, what's the problem? So here's a completely different problem than all the other issues. So Ravina says to him, Amar le, HaTorah amra, tov asher lo tidor, mishetidor v'lo teshalem. Va'at amar likum v'lindor b'tchila. He says to him, what are you talking about? He says, the pasuk in the Torah says, better not to make a vow than to take a vow and not to pay up. We never like people taking vows. Remember Nazir, right? It's not a good thing to be a Nazir. It's not good to take vows upon yourself in general. We talked about it in Nadarim. And basically, you're going to end up like, why are we going to create a situation where you're going to take this vow, Harei Alai? We don't want you to do that because what if something happens? What if you don't fulfill what you promised? We always try to avoid that. So this is not a good solution. Okay, maybe it's not such a different answer than before, like Kima Frishi. No, it really could work. It's just we prefer to avoid it. It is a bit of a different answer. By the way, if you bring it for Achrayut, I forgot to mention this, it just means you sacrifice it, right? Like a regular Korban Shlamim, that's fine. You can bring a sacrifice that's brought Achrayut. Okay, so there are 8 possible answers. 3 we saw yesterday's Shiur, and 5 more we saw today about attempts to say to Rabbi Chiel, it's really a difficulty on Rabbi Chiel, why, right? What could you have suggested otherwise? And here's all the options as to what you could say if the first one, right, first one that was in existence was the Toda, the one that was in existence was the Tmura, right? You give all your possibilities. Oh, if this, then that, if this, then that. But in the end, we had difficulties with all these reasons as to why we wouldn't accept it. Okay, with that, we're going to move. We're almost at Amud Bet, and we're going to move to the new Mishnah. Second topic for today. Ha'omer harei alai toda, yavihi v'lachma menachulin. If you say harei alai toda, then you have to bring the toda with its bread. Okay, just because you just said I'm bringing a toda, well, a toda includes the animal and its breads from chulin. This is a whole different halacha that you're not allowed to bring. You're not allowed to buy sacrifices that you've obligated yourself in. Harei alai, you're obligated. You're not allowed to bring chovot, obligations, from Maser Sheni money. You can't take your Maser Sheni money and go buy animals for sacrifices for chovot. Only for optional things. So Maser Sheni, what does that mean? I have produce in my house I'm supposed to bring to Jerusalem, right? One of the tenths I'm supposed to take from one of the Masers from my produce, bring to the temple. Then I bring it to Jerusalem, redeem it onto money, bring the money to Jerusalem and buy, or I could bring the produce to Jerusalem directly and buy with it. I could buy animals for sacrifices, but only for optional sacrifices. Unless we're going to see one exception to the rule here, but not generally for obligations. If I say I'm going to take upon myself to bring a sacrifice, I have to buy it from non-sacred items and then sanctify it by buying it as the animal. I can't take it from something like Maser Sheni that's already sacred. But if I say, Toda alai menachulin v'lachma min ha'maser, if I say, okay, maybe I should preface this before we even read it. If I say I'm going to bring the animal from Maser Sheni, I actually can. If I take upon the obligation, but while I take on the obligation, I say, but as long as I can bring it with my Maser Sheni money, since from the beginning I already stated it that way, I can do that. So comes the Mishnah and says, but it depends what I said. If I said, Toda alai menachulin, I can bring a Toda from the chulin, I will bring a Toda from the chulin, okay? Just regular, I'm going to bring an animal, but the lachma min ha'maser, but the bread I'm going to buy from Maser Sheni money, I can't do that. Yavihu v'lachma min ha'chulin. I have to bring all of it chulin. Why? Because the assumption is as soon as I say I'm bringing a toda, that means animal with bread. So the fact that I added later, I'm bringing the bread from the maser, even if it was a second later, it doesn't matter. Because I already, in saying I'm going to bring the toda from the chulin, I've already committed, or even if I just said I'm bringing a toda without saying chulin, I've already locked myself in to chulin. I can't buy maser from the maser money. Toda min ha'maser v'lachma min ha'chulin. Okay, we have 4 different possibilities here. Say I'm bringing the toda from the maser, and the bread from the chulin, yavi. Then I can bring the toda from the maaser, but the bread has to come from chulin because that's what I said. Here's the fourth. He v'lachma min maaser. But if I say I'm bringing them both from the maaser, yavi, then I can bring them both from the maaser because I took on the obligation already stating that I was going to bring them from maaser. So now I'm allowed to buy them from maaser sheni money. We're going to see later in the Gemara, it doesn't mean I have to bring them from maaser sheni money. It's just meaning that I can if I want. Lo yavi, now when I am allowed to be from maaser sheni, to bring from maaser sheni money, lo yavi michite maaser sheni, elami ma'ot maaser sheni. I can't bring it from grains that were actual maaser sheni grains that I brought from home, but I can only bring it from money. I could take money to Jerusalem, redeem my fruits onto money, my produce onto money, take it, buy in Jerusalem from the money. Okay, and then I can buy the animal or the bread or the wheat. Amar Rav Huna. Now we're going to go to something else, and then we're going to suggest that our Mishnah contradicts this, even though we're going to say in the end it doesn't. Amar Rav Huna. We're actually going to have two difficulties. Amar Rav Huna, the first from our Mishnah, and that's why this is brought here, and the second from a Braita. Then we're going to go in depth into the Braita a little bit, and that's almost, this is going to take us till almost the end of the daf. Amar Rav Huna, Homer harei alai lachmei todah. If I say I'm going to take upon myself to bring loaves for a Thanksgiving offering, mevi todah v'lachma. That actually committed me to bring the animal, even though I never said I'm bringing the animal. It committed me to bringing the animal because there's no such thing as breads of the todah without the animal. So that's what we're going to say right now. My time, or what's the reason? Meida yada haigavra, the person who committed to this knows the lechem below todah lo ikrit. There's no such thing as bringing breads without an animal sacrifice. The high todah v'lachma kamra, and they basically really did say, even though they didn't, it's like they said I'm bringing an animal and the bread. The high de kamra lachmei todah. Now, why they say just breads of the todah when it really is the bread, or in other words, when he really meant to say the animal and the bread? Well, sof miltanaka. They just kind of brought the end of the sentence. Okay, they brought the last part of it. And the last part's what's important, they said. It's more important to say, like, what's the end of what we're bringing? It's the breads. So they mentioned the last part. But they really meant the whole thing. So now we're going to have a difficulty on this theory from our Mishnah. It's not. Now, if we go by the last thing you say, in this case, what did we say? You're going to bring your todah from the maaser sheni, but you said you're going to bring your bread from the chulin. You have to bring your bread from the chulin. Now, if by saying bread alone, that includes the animal also, so shouldn't we say, since I said yavi lachma min chulin, okay, so first of all, they're going to quote, what does it say? Yavi kamosh nadar. You can bring the todah from the maaser, and you can, the bread though has to be from chulin, but amai, why is that? Since you said the bread from the chulin, if we go by the end of what you said and say that's where you put the stress on the end, maybe you have to bring everything from the chulin, because we say it all follows the last thing you said, which is the bread, and the stress is on the end of what you said, and therefore the bread from the chulin, and bread in and of itself includes the animal, so the animal should be from chulin also. Who says you should be allowed to bring from maaser sheni? Why did the Mishnah say that? So it seems to go against Rav Huna, because the Mishnah doesn't seem to think we go by what you said at the end. To which they say, no, Shani Hatam, de Kevan da Amar Todam in Amaseo. Well, this is very different than what Rav Huna said. Rav Huna's case, you didn't even mention the animal. Here you said the Todah is from the Maaser. So Naasik Omer Harei Alai Lechem Liftor Todato Shel Ploni. It's like you're saying, I'm going to bring bread, the end of that statement, to exempt the meat that I mentioned earlier. In other words, you can't bring meat without the bread. So what I'm saying is I'm also committing to the bread that's going to be in addition, right, to kind of finish up the process of the bread that I mentioned earlier. But that means basically it's like you're saying I'm bringing bread for someone else's offering, meaning only the animal is going to be able to come from the maaser, and it is going to be able to come from the maaser, even though the bread's going to come from the chulin, even though they're a little bit different from each other. To which the Gemara says, really, that's the case? Ihachi, if you could do it in that direction, do it in the other direction too, and that's also not what it says in the Mishnah. So it's a difficulty on the answer that we gave to answer the difficulty against Rav Huna. So ihachi reisha dekatane todam min chulin v'lachma min maaser. Earlier in the Mishnah it said if you bring the todah from the chulin, you say I'm going to bring the todah from the chulin, but the bread from the maaser, yavi hu v'lachma min chulin. Why don't you say everything has to come from the chulin? You have to bring everything from the chulin. Okay, there we explained it for a reason. Here they're going to ignore that reason. There we explained it because you started off with chulin and the bread and the animal. When you say animal, that automatically includes the bread. But they're going to suggest the following. If you said animal from the chulin, bread from maaser, right? Even from maaser. Then why do you have to bring the whole thing from chulin? Hachanami. Why don't we say like this? Naaseh ka'omer harei alai toda liftor lachmo shel ploni. Why don't you say the animal is coming to exempt my bread? And therefore, since my bread is maaser, I said bread being maaser, maybe we can even bring the animal from maaser. Here it's going the reverse. It's saying, if the first case we said that the bread is coming on account of the animal, to exempt the animal, why don't we say here that the animal is coming to exempt the bread? And then we can permit even for Maser Sheni, right, that allow the animal to be brought even for Maser Sheni. So you say, how are you comparing those two? You can't flip it in the other direction because Bishlam Alechem Lemifter Todate, the bread is actually coming to exempt the Toda offering. In other words, the Toda offering is the central part. The bread is just coming to exempt it. But Toda, Lemifter Alechem Mi'ate, the Toda doesn't come, the animal doesn't come to exempt the bread. It's the reverse. So you can't say that the animal follows the bread. And that's why in that case in the Mishnah, the animal doesn't follow the bread. Animal never follows the bread. It's only the bread that could follow the animal. And that's why we said in the previous case, but not in this case. Okay, now we're getting off to the second difficulty with Rav Huna. Rav Huna again said, if I say bread, just bread, I obviously mean animal and bread. So Tashma, let's look at this source. Ha'omer harei alai toda below lechem v'zevach below nesachim. I'm going to bring a toda without bread. I'm going to bring a sacrifice without the libations that go along with it. We force the person to bring their sacrifice the way it's supposed to be brought, the toda with the bread and the sacrifice with the nesachim, right? Either or, depending on what the situation was. So what do they infer from this? They make an inference, which is an interesting inference. I don't know, I would have necessarily thought this, but Tama de amal toda, the word toda is missing here. The reason this is because you said toda, I'm bringing the animal. Aval lo amar toda, but it sounds like if you didn't say toda, we wouldn't make you bring everything. Lo. Now, what would that mean? What if you just said bread? Sounds like you wouldn't have to bring. Now, what did Rav Huna say? You said, I'm bringing bread. You have to bring, right? Force you to bring the animal and the bread. But this seems to say only if you said the animal, not the bread. So, huadin afagav de lo amar toda. And they say, no. You could say that you don't necessarily infer that. This is the case also even if you just said the toda. But even if you didn't say toda and you just said the bread, sorry, I said that wrong. Even if you just said the bread, now, why didn't they say it though? Why didn't they give that case? What if I just said bread? I actually am also forced to bring the bread and the animal. But because of the zevach below nesachim, de lo matne le nesachim below zevach, tananami toda. You couldn't possibly say the reverse about the libations. If I say I'm bringing bread, but I don't say I'm bringing a toda, there's no such offering as bread without a toda. Lechamim always means the toda. But if I say I'm bringing libations without mentioning a sacrifice, of course there's such a thing. I can offer to voluntarily bring libations to the temple. So since that's the case, I don't have to bring them with a sacrifice. So of course we don't force anyone to bring a sacrifice just because they said I'm bringing libations. So therefore they didn't say the flip case in the bread either, but it doesn't mean they didn't mean it, and therefore it's not a contradiction. Now they're going to ask a question on the bright. Okay, so we're done with the difficulties against Rav Huna. We've resolved it. But now that we brought this bright, we're going to have a difficulty, which is, Amai. Why is this the case? Neder upitcho imohu. This is a classic case. If I say I'm bringing a toda without bread, I am basically vowing to bring a toda. And then a second later, I'm saying, but I don't want to bring bread. And when I find out that, oh, well, you have to bring bread, well, I could say, that's not what I meant, right? I didn't mean to bring the bread. I don't want it. Had I known I was supposed to bring bread, I never would have brought it. So how do we resolve this? Well, we're now going to see there's a machloket beit Shammai beit Hillel about this. So Chizkiah is going to say, we're going to have Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan each giving different interpretations. Amar Chizkiah hamane beit Shammai. This all goes by beit Shammai. De amrei tfas l'sham rishon. Beit Shammai says if you say contradictory things, we go by the first thing you say. So you started and said, I'm bringing a toda. You have to bring a toda. The fact that you said without bread, we ignore that. How do we know Beit Shammai says? It's none. There's a Mishnah in Nazir. Hareini Nazir min agrogrot umin atvela. I'm a Nazir and I'm not going to, I'm not going to eat figs and I'm not going to eat dates. Grogrot, figs, and I think it's dates, but whatever. You're basically saying I'm not going to eat something that normally, right? Nazir is allowed to eat those things. Nazir can't eat grapes. That's not what he said. Beit Shammai omrim nazir, because he goes by, you said hareini nazir. Who cares what you said after that seems to contradict? Beit Hillel omrim no nazir, because Beit Hillel says, basically, you said, right, I'm a nazir, and then you said, well, I'm in a grow, but obviously that wasn't what you meant, was to really be a nazir and not have grapes or wine. So you undo your neder basically by saying that. Rabbi Yochanan Amar filu tema Beit Hillel. So in other words, Chizkiah basically says, but that source we saw before is obviously by Beit Shammai. We just followed the first thing you said. You said, I'm bringing a toda, I'm bringing a sacrifice. The fact that you said after, without libations, without bread, irrelevant. But Rabbi Yochanan says, afilu tema Beit Hillel. I'm going to explain that brighter, even according to Beit Hillel, who basically, in the case of the Nazir, would not view you as a Nazir, but here you would be obligated. Why? Omer, he says it must be a case where you said the following thing. It's not just this is what we say, kimta. It was in a particular case. Omer, it must be a case where you said, had I known that I had to bring bread, well, I would have said, I'll bring the bread too. I would never have said, I won't bring it out. I thought there was an option. I could bring it with breads. I could bring it without bread. So I said I was going to do it without bread. But had you told me, of course I would want to bring it with the breads. I want to do the right thing. So that, then there's no petachimo. You didn't say, had I realized, I never would have said this. That's not the case. So the one problem is that it doesn't really seem to match the language, because what did it say in the Braita? If you say you bring a toda without bread, or the zevach without the libations, kofino to, we force you to bring it. Why do you need to force people if that's what the person said they wanted to do? So my kofim, right? If I say to you, had you known, like, don't you know you're supposed to bring the bread? You say, I didn't realize. Of course I want to bring the bread. So then why are we forcing you? Of course you want to do it yourself. So my kofim, de kabai hadrabe. And as we're talking about a case when after a few minutes later you said, maybe not. You realize what you're getting yourself into. And then it's too late at that point because you've already done it. You've already committed. Okay, tashma. Now we're going to have a difficulty on Rabbi Yochanan. Ha'omer harei alai toda b'lo lechem v'zevach b'lo nesachim, a different source about the same case. You said, I'm bringing a toda without bread. I'm bringing a sacrifice without the libations. V'amru lo, and they said to him, havei toda v'lachma v'zevach u'nesachim. And then they said to him, bring a toda with bread. You can't bring it without bread. Bring your sacrifice with the libations. V'omer, and the person says, ilu ayiti odeh sheken lo ayiti noder. There's no way I would have made this neder. Now, what would Beit Hillel say? So fine, your neder's undone. But what does it say here? Kofino tova omrim lo shmor v'shamata. They force you and they say, you have to observe this and listen. Okay, in a minute we're going to say, what is shmor and shamata? What is it? What are those two words meaning? But anyway, right now they're going to say, bishlam al chizkiah nichale. This works perfectly according to Chizkiah, because Chizkiah doesn't believe, right? We go by tfos l'shon rishon, like Beit Shammai. Al Rabbi Yochanan kasha. So Rabbi Yochanan would say, if the person says, I didn't want to do that, then we undo the vow. So what's Rabbi Yochanan going to answer? Amar lecha Rabbi Yochanan could simply answer, Havadai Beit Shammai. That source is Beit Shammai, okay? Beit Hillel disagrees. Okay, very simple. Now the Gemara is going to ask, Mai shmor v'shamata? Why the double language? Observe and listen. Rabbi shmor means have todah, v'shamata have lachma. Shamor means they tell him, Shamor, keep what you said, which is the todah. And not only that, v'shamata, well, now that you learned, you also have to bring the bread as well. Rav has a different explanation. Rav Amar Shmuel means have todah v'lachma. No, Shmor already means observe this, meaning bring it the way you're supposed to. Bread with the animal. Vishamata, well, you should learn, shalot tehi ragil la'asot. You shouldn't do this very often. In other words, watch your words and learn the halacha that you know that there's no such thing as korban todah without the bread. And there's no such thing as a sacrifice without libations. So get your story straight and know that when you commit to doing these things, it's going to come with other obligations as well. Okay, now we're back to, that ends that big section of Rav Huna that we started with Rav Huna. From there we had two difficulties on him. The second one was this other one from our Mishnah, which we resolved. The second one was from this Braita, and then we delved into the Braita to understand it better. We had two approaches, whether the Braita is really Beit Hillel, or maybe it could also be Beit Shammai. Now we're going to go back to the Mishnah. So I'm putting the words todah, I'm removing them because some of the versions don't have this word. The way we saw it in the Mishnah appeared like this. Hi v'lachma min ha'maaser yavi. Okay, hi v'lachma. If you say hi v'lachma min ha'maaser, then you can bring both from the maaser. That was the last case in the Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, Yavi, you have to bring from the maaser? as I mentioned earlier, lo sagidi lo maite, what you have to buy it from Maser Sheni produce? No. So Rav Nachman v'Rav Chisda amrei ratza mivi lo ratza lo yavi. No, you can. It's an option. It doesn't mean you have to. The whole thing is we're trying to, right, if you said I'm committing, but only if I buy it from Maser, then we're allowing you to buy from Maser Sheni money. But if you don't want to, of course you could buy it from regular money, like all other sacrifices that are brought from the chulin, like all other obligatory offerings. Okay, now the last line in the Mishnah, we're going to get started on the sugya, but we'll finish it in tomorrow's daf. V'lo yavi michite maaser sheni elami ma'o maaser sheni. Don't take from grains of maaser sheni, but from the maaser sheni money. So, what does that mean? Rav Nachman v'Rav Chisda amar travayu lo shanu ela michite maaser sheni. The one thing you can't use is the grains that were from your house that you're bringing. Okay, that you can. But michitin halikuchot maaser sheni yavi. But you can go to Jerusalem, buy grains, and then later say, oh, you know, these grains I bought with my Maser Sheni money, I can actually use them to now use for the breads here. Okay, so you don't have to actually go out and spend your Maser Sheni money on grains for this purpose. You can buy grains and then say, oh, I bought these with Maser Sheni money, well, now I can use them. Okay, so that's what it means. Don't bring from the grains, but you can bring from money. You can even bring from grains that you bought with money in Jerusalem. And in fact, Rabbi Yirmiyah says the same thing. Yativ Rabbi Yirmiyah kamed Rabbi Zera v'yativ v'kamar. He was sitting in front of Rabbi Zera and he said exactly what Rav Chisda and Rav Nachman said. Lo shanu ela michite maaser sheni. The only thing that's problematic is to actually use the grains that were maaser sheni that you took from your produce, from your house. Aval michitina lekucho b'ma'o maaser sheni yavi. But if you're in Jerusalem and you buy grains with the maaser sheni money and now you want to use them for your bread, you can. Amar le. But Rabbi Zera says to him, Rabbi, ata omer kain. Says that's what you say, but I think you can't bring from grains that you bought for Maser Sheni money. You have to actually take the Maser Sheni money. If you want to use Maser Sheni, take the money, buy grains for this purpose. Okay, we don't yet know why. We're going to have to wait till tomorrow for that. I'm going to tell you the logic for your position. I'm going to tell you the logic for my position. And for that, we'll wait till tomorrow. See that in the next step. So what we did today, we started with the 8 possibilities as to when Rabbi Chia said there is no solution if your tmura gets mixed up with your toda and you now, one of them dies and you need to bring one of those animals and you're not sure which one it is, there's no solution to which they, right? Because either you're going to bring the tmura without the breads or the toda with the breads. And then we got into a whole long 8 suggestions, 3 we saw in yesterday's daf, 5 more in today's daf about possible suggestions that you could do to resolve this problem. But each time we brought a difficulty, and the chart will be very useful for reviewing that. Then we got to the Mishnah about that you have to buy obligatory offerings specifically from chulin unless you specify before that you would buy from the maaser. But then it depends, did you say the bread or the animal, and which one did you say is chulin, which one's maaser? And that allowed us to say sometimes maybe there's certain cases where you're allowed to buy from the maaser. Then we brought Rav Huna's halacha that when you say I'm going to bring lachmei todah, that includes the animal as well, even though you didn't say the animal, you obviously meant it. And then we had 2 difficulties, one from the Mishnah and one from this other Braita. From there, we got off on the Braita, like I said, into 2 different explanations. Is it only according to Beit Shammai, or was it also according to Beit Hillel? That was Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. We had a difficulty with Rabbi Yochanan's approach, but resolved it by basically bringing some other Braita that seems to go against, but then we said, oh, he could just simply say that's Beit Shammai's approach. And then we had the fact that when you bring it from the maaser, the cases where you're allowed to just means you're allowed to, you don't have to. And we ended with, you can't buy from the chitim maaser sheni, you can't buy with money. The question is, you can't use the money in maaser sheni to buy the grains. What if you bought the grains already with maaser sheni money? Can you now say, oh, I want to use those for my toda? Well, we saw Rabbi Zera against Rabbi Yirmiyah. We also saw Rav Chisda and Rav Nachman who permitted it. Rabbi Yirmiyah permitted it. Comes Rabbi Zera and he's going to start explaining what's the logic of the other position, what's my position. That we'll see in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a good day and a Chag Sameach.